I received this clock movement today in the mail. It belongs to Robert from Wisconsin. He has a nice Seth Thomas he's restoring. He's been unable to keep the movement running and wanted me to do an evaluation on it. Ah, nice looking movement. The case this movement goes to was not shipped. Robert's restoring it right now. Here's an image of the front of the case. Very nice shape this clock is in. An image of the back. The image of the bottom shows the date code 4981J. This is the production year of the case, which is October 1894. I'll get it over to the bench and see if I can give Robert an idea of what's going on with it, and to check it for finish imperfections first. The gold gilt is thin in places. It has some dark spots and streaks on it. Looks to be from the original manufacturer process. And here's some damage caused by fingerprints. Oils and sweat in fingerprints will cause corrosion on clock parts. You can see corrosion left behind in the shape of fingerprints. You should always handle these movements from the edges of the plates. And here, just below the Seth Thomas USA logo, the gold gilt, it's taken on a sort of reptile skin look to it, a bunch of circular spots. Even the gear just below the plate has an unevenness to the gold gilt finish. Not sure if this is an original process problem or if it happened after it left the factory. More fingerprint damage. And now I'll check for pivot wear on the front plate, on the time side of the movement. The second wheel pivot hole shows some wear. Third wheel pivot hole shows some wear. As well as the fourth pivot hole also shows some wear. And the escape wheel pivot hole, it shows wear also, and it's obviously egg-shaped. These should have bushings installed in them after the pivots are polished. Now the pivot holes on the front plate of the strike side. The second wheel pivot hole shows some wear. The third and fourth pivot holes both show wear also. And the governor pivot hole, it shows some slight wear. These could have bushings installed in them, but I've seen working movements in service with more wear in them than these. Now to inspect the rear plate for surface defects. This dimension on here, 3 5/8, refers to the suspension rod length, which is dependent on the gearing the movement is set up for. The gold gilt is uneven on this plate also. It has splotches of thick and thin areas. And here, there's damage from multiple fingerprints. The fingerprints have etched themselves into the finish on the plate. I'm not sure if they'll clean. It looks like they've been on here for a long time. So many fingerprints on this movement. Here next to the center wheel pivot, there's some greenish corrosion. Green corrosion on brass indicates the copper in the brass is oxidizing. This could be from a thin spot in the gold gilt or even a scratch in the gold gilt. Now to inspect the pivot holes on the time side of the rear plate. The second wheel shows some wear. The third wheel pivot hole. The fourth wheel pivot hole. And the escape wheel pivot hole. The escape wheel pivot hole shows considerable wear. Now to inspect the pivot holes on the strike side of the rear plate. The second wheel pivot hole shows some wear. The third wheel pivot hole, it shows some wear as well. And the fourth wheel pivot hole shows a little wear. And the governor pivot hole, it shows quite a bit of wear. And he's not been able to keep this running. Now to look for any general problems that are obvious. The center wheel pivot hole is nice and snug. It sure wants to run again. Excess of dirt has collected on only one side of this lantern pinion. On the opposite side, it's fairly clean. This tells me the movement has sat unused for a considerable amount of time. Signs of rust here. Dried oil on the lantern pinion trundles. All the shafts are clean on one side, and the opposite side is dirty. A fresh Q-tip shows the parts have a thin layer of rust-colored oil on them. This is the shaft used to regulate the time. The spring that holds it in place is tangled with the locking wire. I always install a washer between the locking wire and the spring, so this won't happen. Just in rotating the shaft, if the spring hangs up on the plate, the spring will start coiling on the wire. That's what we're looking at right here. It's causing too much end shake on the shaft. It could be this simple item right here that the owners decided not to use this clock anymore. This condition could cause an interference problem with the escape wheel. Looking on the back plate, the worm gear is now free to contact the escape wheel. This could cause the movement to stop at random times. Real frustrating for an owner. Moving to the escape wheel, I'll put a piece of tape here for a reference point. I want to inspect how the teeth interact with the pallets on the verge. At the moment the escape wheel tooth drops off the entrance pallet, the exit pallet should be in position to receive the next escape wheel tooth. The cycles should be equal for the full 360 degrees of the escape wheel. After rotating 180 degrees, the escape wheel tooth isn't able to drop off the entrance pallet. I suspect the escape wheel is slightly out of round, which isn't really unusual. But most of the problem is most likely coming from wear on the escape wheel pivot hole. This can be verified by simply raising the escape wheel up slightly. Wow, look at it take off and run now. And when I let it drop back down in its resting position, it stops. It should have a bushing installed to correct this issue. Another issue is the pallet surfaces, where the escape wheel teeth strike it are worn. The pallets also have some rust on them that should be polished off. There's almost a 30,000th groove worn in both the entrance and exit pallets. This should be corrected. They can be resurfaced and polished. The mainsprings look to be stuck together. I see this a lot in older movements that haven't been serviced in the last 50 years or so. To check them, you can just put some side pressure on them. And if they snap and jerk into place, yep, this will cause the movement to stop at random times. It's also a cause for erratic timekeeping. The oil in these mainsprings has all dried up. I'll get this information to Robert and see how he wants to move forward on this movement.